Sometimes the greatest moments of our lives arrive unannounced, in the middle of a storm we never saw coming. And sometimes they arrive on four legs, soaking wet, asking us to be braver than we ever thought possible. High in the Montana mountains, a woman seeking peace opens her door to a desperate wolf, carrying 3 helpless pups through a raging storm. She breaks every rule and lets them inside. Then strange things begin. The wolves refuse to leave. Unknown tracks circle her cabin. Ancient symbols appear carved into nearby trees. The nightly howling sounds, less like wolves and more like something calling her name. Old-timers speak of mountain guardians who emerge when darkness gathers, seeking one human to trust. But why her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at 7,200 feet, tucked between 2 ridges of ponderosa pine, where the air thinned and the silence ran deep. Nora Winslow had chosen this place precisely because it demanded nothing from her except survival. No phones ringing at midnight, no case files stacking up like accusations, no husband's disappointed sighs when she came home too tired to pretend everything was fine. Just wind through the trees, the crack of her axe splitting firewood, and the particular quiet that comes when you're far enough from civilization that your own thoughts become the loudest thing around. She'd been here 8 months now, and the solitude had started to feel less like exile and more like exactly where she belonged. The morning routine never varied. Up at dawn, coffee on the propane stove, oatmeal with dried berries she'd bought in bulk from the general store 20 miles down the mountain. She'd check the solar panels, make sure the water filter was running clean, then spend an hour splitting wood for the stove. Physical labor had a way of quieting the mind that therapy never managed. By mid-morning, she'd usually take a walk. The trails around her property weren't official, just game paths and old logging roads that went nowhere anymore, but she'd learned them well enough to navigate without thinking. That was the point, to move through the world without the constant calculation of what everyone needed from you. Nora was 36. Though people usually guessed younger until they looked at her eyes. That's where the years showed, not in lines or gray hair, but in a certain wariness that came from spending a decade trying to save people who didn't always want saving. She'd been a social worker in Seattle. Child welfare, specifically. The kind of work that either builds you up or breaks you down, and there's not much middle ground. For 9 years, she'd thought she was built for it. She'd handled the late-night calls, the court appearances, the families who hated her for doing her job, and the families who begged her to do more than the system allowed. Then came the Johnson case. 16-year-old boy, bright kid, caught in a bad situation with a mother who loved him but couldn't stay sober long enough to keep him safe. Nora had worked with them for 8 months. She'd gotten the mother into rehab twice, set up supervised visits, believed every promise that this time would be different. The third time the mother relapsed, Nora made the call, removed the boy, placed him in a group home temporarily while they worked out long-term options. Standard procedure, the right call by every metric that mattered. 2 weeks later, the boy ran. They found him 3 days after that, hypothermic and unresponsive under a bridge. He survived, but the light had gone out of his eyes in a way that Nora recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror. That's when she understood she'd been breaking for a long time. So gradually, she hadn't noticed until the fracture went all the way through. Her marriage had already been hanging by threads. Her husband had been patient for years, but patience has limits. When she told him she needed to quit, needed to leave the city, needed to find somewhere quiet where she could remember who she'd been before the work consumed her, he'd asked a fair question, and what about what I need? She didn't have a good answer, so he'd made the decision easier by leaving first. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks before she found this cabin. Her grandmother's place, technically, though her grandmother had been dead for 15 years. The property had passed to Nora's mother, who'd wanted nothing to do with it, and then to Nora when her mother died of cancer 6 years ago. Nora had never even seen it, Just paid the property taxes every year and forgot about it until she needed somewhere to disappear. The cabin was smaller than she'd expected. One room really, with a loft for sleeping and a wood stove that heated the whole space, if you kept it fed. No running water. There was a spring-fed creek 50 yards down the hill and a gravity-fed system her grandmother had rigged up decades ago. The outhouse was another 30 yards in the opposite direction, which made for cold trips in winter but gave her plenty of motivation not to drink too much tea before bed. It was primitive by modern standards, but it had solar panels her grandmother must have added in the 90s, and the propane stove worked fine for cooking. There were shelves lined with canning jars, empty now, but Nora had plans to learn how to fill them come summer. A bookshelf held a mix of practical guides and old paperbacks, their spines cracked from multiple readings, and in the corner, wrapped in oilcloth, she'd found her grandmother's journal. Nora hadn't known her grandmother well. The old woman had left the mountain when Nora's mother was young, moved to Spokane, worked as a nurse until she retired. She'd visited this cabin every summer, always alone, but never talked much about it. Just said it was a place she'd grown up, a place that held memories. The journal changed Nora's understanding of that. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like a field guide to the mountain, written in her grandmother's precise handwriting. Notes about which plants were edible, where to find the best fishing, how to read the weather by watching the birds. But mixed in were other things. Stories maybe, or folklore. References to old traditions, to patterns in nature that meant more than they seemed. One entry, dated summer of 1962, simply read, "The mountain remembers what we forget. It keeps its bargains even when we don't." Nora had read it 3 times, trying to parse the meaning, then decided her grandmother had just been poetic. Old people got that way sometimes, especially when they spent too much time alone. Still, she kept the journal close. Read it most nights before bed, learning the mountain through her grandmother's eyes. The general store was her only real connection to the outside world. 20 miles down a Forest Service road that was barely maintained, the place was run by a man named Vernon Moss, who had to be pushing 80 but moved like someone 20 years younger. He had the kind of face that looked carved from the same stone as the mountains, weathered, permanent, knowing. Vernon had taken one look at Nora, the first time she'd come in for supplies, and said, "You're old Margaret's granddaughter." Got her eyes. Nora had been surprised he'd known her grandmother. Vernon just shrugged. Margaret used to come through every summer. Good woman. Understood things most folks don't bother with. He'd helped her load supplies into her truck. Beans, rice, flour, coffee, the bulk goods that would last through winter. As she was leaving, he'd added, "You planning to stay up there year-round?" "That's the idea." Vernon had nodded slowly. "Mountains different in winter. Quiet in ways that can get loud if you're not careful. You need anything, you come down. Don't wait until you're desperate." It was good advice, and Nora had taken it. She came down every 3 weeks or so, restocked, exchanged a few words with Vernon, then headed back up. He never pried, never asked why a woman her age was living alone on a mountain. She appreciated that. The only other person she'd met was her nearest neighbor, Catherine Brennan. Kit, she insisted on being called. Kit lived about 5 miles east, in a slightly larger cabin with actual plumbing and a satellite dish. She was in her early 40s, compact and muscular, with short grey hair and the kind of tan that came from spending every possible hour outside. Kit had shown up one afternoon in late fall, arriving on a 4-wheeler with a bottle of whiskey and an easy smile. "Figured I should introduce myself before the snow comes and we're both trapped in our own little worlds," she'd said. "I'm Kit. I guide hunters in the fall, do some wildfire consulting in summer, and mostly keep to myself the rest of the time." They'd shared the whiskey on Nora's porch, watching the sun set behind the western ridge. Kit didn't ask the questions most people asked. "Where are you from? What do you do? Why are you here?" She just talked about the mountain, about the elk migration patterns, and the best places to see wildflowers come spring. When she left, she'd said, "Radio's on Channel 7 if you need anything. I check it twice a day, morning and evening. Don't be a stranger, but don't feel obligated either." Some of us come up here because we like our own company best. Nora had liked her immediately, but mostly Nora was alone. And that was exactly what she needed. The days developed their own rhythm. Chores in the morning, a long walk after lunch, reading or studying her grandmother's journal in the afternoon. She'd started sketching the plants she found, trying to match them to the descriptions in the journal. Some she recognized: kinnikinnick, Oregon grape, wild strawberry. Others were mysteries she was still working out. Evenings, she'd cook something simple, then sit on the porch, if the weather allowed, and watch the light fade from the sky. This was the best part of the day, when the world went soft and quiet, and the weight she'd been carrying for years felt just a little bit lighter. She was learning to be still, learning that not every silence needed to be filled, not every problem needed to be solved, not every hurt needed to be examined and understood and processed. Sometimes things just were, and you could let them be. The nightmares had started to fade. The ones where she was back in court or knocking on doors or finding that boy under the bridge, but this time too late. They still came sometimes, but less often, less vivid. She was healing, she thought. Slowly, the way bones heal, deep and invisible, until suddenly you realize you're whole again. The mountain had a presence she was still getting used to. Not threatening exactly, but aware. She'd catch herself talking to it sometimes, narrating her day like she used to do with the therapy dog at her old office. Found a good patch of chanterelles today. Think I'll dry some for winter, or winds picking up from the north. Vernon said that means snow's coming. It felt less crazy than it probably was. The mountain didn't answer, but it listened. She was sure of that. October had been golden and mild. November brought the first real snow, 6 inches overnight, that transformed everything into something from a postcard. Nora had stood on her porch that morning, coffee steaming in her hands, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something bigger than her own churning thoughts. The mountain in winter was vast and clean and utterly indifferent to human concerns, and there was freedom in that indifference. She'd made the right choice coming here. Whatever else was uncertain, that much was clear. The animals had started appearing more frequently as winter deepened. Deer in the meadow below her cabin, their breath visible in the cold air. A red fox that seemed to have a regular route past her woodpile. Ravens that gathered in the tall pine behind the outhouse, their calls echoing through the valley, and wolves. She'd heard them first in late November, distant howling that drifted through the darkness like smoke. Vernon had mentioned there was a pack that ranged through this part of the mountains, but they usually kept well away from humans. Smart animals, he'd said. They know we're trouble. Nora had seen tracks a few times. Larger than any dog, the distinctive pattern of a predator moving with purpose. Once she'd glimpsed movement through the trees during an evening walk, something large and grey, there and gone so fast she couldn't be sure she'd really seen it. It should have scared her. Instead, it felt right. This was their home, after all. She was just a visitor, even if she planned to be a permanent one. The journal had a section about wolves. Her grandmother had written, "They're not what people think. Not devils, not saints. Just another form of life trying to survive in a hard world. The old ones say wolves know things we've forgotten. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's just stories. Either way, respect costs nothing and might mean everything." Nora thought about that a lot. By early December, she'd settled into a routine that felt sustainable. She had enough firewood to last until March. Her pantry was stocked. The cabin stayed warm, even when the temperature dropped below zero. She'd figured out how to keep the water system from freezing, and how to make bread that didn't taste like cardboard, and how to pass the long evenings without going stir-crazy. She was making it. Actually making it. That should have been her first warning that something was about to change. Life had taught her that the moment you started feeling secure, the ground shifted under your feet. But she'd gotten comfortable, let her guard down, so when the storm came, she wasn't ready. None of the signs she'd learned to read had predicted it. The sky had been clear that morning. No shift in the wind. No strange behavior from the animals. Just another December day, cold and bright and ordinary. By noon, clouds had moved in from the north. By 2, the first flakes were falling. By sunset, the world had disappeared into white chaos, and something was howling in the darkness beyond her door. The storm came on like nothing Nora had ever experienced. She'd lived through Seattle winters, through mountain squalls that Vernon had warned her about, through weather that made the old-timers shake their heads and talk about the winters of their youth. This was different. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It hit the cabin in waves that made the walls shudder, that sent anything not tied down skittering across the floor. Snow came horizontal, so thick she couldn't see the woodpile 15 feet from her door, and the lightning. She'd never seen lightning in a snowstorm before, but it came in flashes of greenish-white that lit up the world for split seconds, showing her the trees bending almost double, the snow swirling in patterns that looked almost deliberate. The power went out around 7. Not that she relied on the solar panels much at night, but losing them felt significant, like the storm had cut her off from even that small connection to the modern world. She fed the wood stove, checked her supplies. She had everything she needed to wait it out. Food, water, firewood, candles, oil lamps. The cabin had survived decades of mountain weather. It would survive this. But the howling, at first she'd thought it was just the wind. The way it shrieked through the eaves, found every gap in the logs, turned the whole cabin into an enormous instrument playing a song of chaos. But as the night deepened, she started to hear something else underneath, something that rose and fell with its own rhythm, independent of the wind's chaos. Wolves. Multiple voices, calling to each other through the storm, closer than she'd ever heard them. Nora stood at the window, peering out through the small gap she'd cleared in the ice forming on the glass. She couldn't see anything but white and darkness, the occasional flash of lightning revealing nothing but more snow. Then, around 9, the howling stopped. The silence was worse. The wind still raged, but that other sound, that living sound, had cut off like someone had closed a door. Nora told herself it didn't mean anything. The pack had moved on, found shelter, settled in to wait out the storm like every other creature with sense. But her grandmother's journal was open on the table, and her eyes kept drifting to that one entry. The mountain remembers what we forget. At 10:30, something hit the porch, not like a branch falling or debris blown by the wind. A solid thump, followed by a scraping sound. Then nothing. Nora grabbed the flashlight, her heart hammering. Every piece of wilderness advice she'd learned said to stay inside, stay safe, don't investigate strange sounds in a storm. But the cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls less solid, and she needed to know what was out there. She cracked the door open. The wind tried to rip it from her hands, driving snow into her face so hard it stung. She had to brace herself against the frame, squinting into the chaos. The flashlight beam swallowed by the white. Then the lightning flashed. In that split second of green-white illumination, she saw it. A wolf. Massive grey and black, soaking wet. Standing at the edge of her porch, maybe 6 feet away. Not crouched to attack, not snarling. Just standing there looking directly at her, with eyes that reflected the flashlight beam in twin points of amber. The darkness returned, but the image burned in Nora's vision. The wolf's size, bigger than any dog she'd seen. The way it had been standing, almost patient, like it was waiting for something, another flash of lightning. The wolf was still there, and now she could see what she'd missed before. Behind it, 3 small shapes huddled against the porch railing. Pups, maybe 3 months old, shivering violently, their fur plastered to their small bodies. The wolf, the mother. Nora understood now. Took a step forward. Every instinct screamed at Nora to slam the door. Throw the bolt. Hide in the cabin until morning. Wolves were wild animals, dangerous, unpredictable. Opening your door to one was the kind of stupid that got people killed, but the pups were dying. She could see it, even in the brief flashes of light. Hypothermia, probably. Too young to survive this kind of storm without shelter, and the mother wolf wasn't attacking. She was asking. The thought was crazy. Wolves didn't ask for help from humans. But the way she stood there, the way her eyes held Nora's gaze through the chaos, it felt like communication. like a choice being offered. Nora heard herself say, "You can't be serious." The wolf didn't move, just waited. Another flash of lightning showed the pups more clearly. One was barely moving. "Damn it," Nora whispered. She opened the door wider and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wolf stood in the storm, snow accumulating on her shoulders, eyes locked on Nora's face, weighing something, deciding. Then she turned, picked up one of the pups by the scruff of its neck, gentle, the way a mother cat carries kittens, and brought it inside. Nora's hands were shaking. This was insane. She was letting a wolf into her home, a predator, an animal that could kill her without much effort. But the wolf laid the pup on the rug near the wood stove, looked at Nora once more, then went back outside. The second pup, then the third. All three lay where the mother placed them, too exhausted to do more than shiver. The smallest one, the one that had barely been moving, had a distinctive marking on its forehead, a patch of silver-white fur in the shape of a crescent moon. The mother wolf was the last to enter. She shook once, spraying water across the floor, then positioned herself between the pups and Nora. Not aggressive, but clear. The message was obvious. "I'm trusting you with my children, but I'm still watching." Nora closed the door. The wind's howl became muted, the cabin suddenly feeling very small and very full. "Okay," she said, her voice barely steady. "Okay, let's see what we can do." She'd done first aid training as part of her social work job. People first aid, but some principles were universal. Warmth, dry them off. Check for injuries. She grabbed every towel she owned, approached the pups slowly. The mother wolf's eyes tracked her every movement, a low rumble starting in her chest. "I'm trying to help," Nora said quietly. "That's all. Just help." Whether the wolf understood or not, she didn't attack. Nora began with the smallest pup, the one with the silver marking. Its eyes were half closed, breathing shallow. She wrapped it in a towel, rubbed gently to dry the fur and stimulate circulation. The pup made a small sound, not quite a whimper, more like a sigh, and its eyes opened briefly. They were blue. "Bright, startling blue. There you are," Nora murmured. "Stay with me, little one." She worked through all three pups, drying them, checking for obvious injuries, arranging them on towels near the stove where the heat would reach them but not overwhelm. They were exhausted, malnourished, stressed, but alive. That was something. The mother wolf watched it all with an intensity that made Nora's skin prickle. This was not a normal dog. This was not even a normal wolf, she was starting to realize. There was something too aware in those eyes, too much understanding in the way she observed Nora's movements. When Nora finished with the pups, she looked at the mother. "Your turn." The wolf's ears flicked, but she didn't move. "You're soaked through," Nora said. "And I'm not having you die of hypothermia in my living room after all this drama." She approached with another towel, slowly, telegraphing every movement. When she got within arm's reach, the wolf went very still. Nora could see the muscles bunched under the wet fur, the power coiled there. One wrong move and this would end badly. She placed the towel on the wolf's shoulders and began to rub. Gentle but firm. The wolf closed her eyes. For the next 15 minutes, Nora dried a wild animal that could have torn her throat out any time it wanted. The wolf stood perfectly still, trembling occasionally but never pulling away. When Nora finished, the wolf shook once more, then lay down next to her pups, curling her body around them. The smallest pup, the silver-marked one, crawled onto the mother's belly and closed its eyes. Nora sat back against the wall, her heart still hammering, reality finally catching up with her. She had 4 wolves in her cabin, a mother and 3 pups, wild animals, predators. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind hitting new peaks of fury. The lightning was almost constant now, turning the world beyond her windows into a strobe-lit nightmare. And something else was out there. She could feel it, even if she couldn't explain how. Something that made the wolves run to her door. Something that made the mother choose to trust a human rather than face the storm alone. Nora looked at the journal on the table, at the entry about the mountain, remembering. "What have I done?" she whispered. The wolf's eyes opened, amber and knowing, and Nora had the strangest feeling that the question wasn't what she'd done, It was what came next. The storm didn't break with morning. If anything, it intensified. Nora woke from an uneasy sleep, slumped against the wall, to find pale grey light filtering through the windows and snow piled halfway up the glass. The wind was a constant roar, punctuated by crashes as branches gave way under the weight of ice and snow. The wolves were still there. Part of her had hoped it was all a fever dream, some stress-induced hallucination. But no, the mother wolf lay in the exact spot she'd settled the night before. 3 pups sprawled around her, all breathing steadily. The smallest one, the one with the silver marking, lifted its head as Nora stirred. Those blue eyes tracked her with an awareness that seemed impossible for an animal that young. "Morning," Nora said quietly. Her voice sounded hoarse. "How's everyone feeling?" The pup yawned, showing tiny, sharp teeth, then settled back against its mother's belly. Nora stood slowly, her back protesting from the night spent on the floor. She needed to assess the situation. Food, water, warmth, the basics that would keep them all alive until the storm passed. The wood stove had burned down to coals. She fed it carefully, adding small pieces first to catch, then larger logs to sustain. The cabin warmed quickly, one advantage of the small space. Coffee seemed important. She put water on to boil, measured out grounds, tried to pretend this was a normal morning. Just her and some houseguests, very large, very wild houseguests who could theoretically eat her. The mother wolf watched her move around the cabin but didn't seem concerned. When Nora approached to check on the pups, the wolf's tail gave a small thump against the floor. Was that a good sign? Nora had no idea. Her knowledge of wolf behavior consisted of nature documentaries and a vague sense that you should never run from a predator. The pups looked better than they had last night. Their fur had dried into fluffy spikes, making them look almost cute despite the wildness in their features. The silver-marked one was definitely the smallest, maybe the runt of the litter. The other 2 were larger, their markings more traditional, grey and black in varying patterns. She found herself naming them in her head. Silver, for the obvious reason. The largest pup, with a dark mask across its face, became Shadow. The third, with reddish undertones in its grey fur, became Ember. "Don't name them," she told herself firmly. "They're not pets. They're leaving as soon as the storm breaks." But even as she said it, she knew something had shifted. Opening that door last night had been a choice, and choices had consequences. By midday, the storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the lightning had intensified, those strange green-white flashes that made everything look otherworldly. Nora had tried the radio, hoping to catch a weather report, or at least confirm that the world still existed beyond her cabin. Nothing but static. Every channel dead air that shouldn't have been possible. Vernon's general store had a powerful transmitter. Even in the worst weather, she should have been able to pick up something. The mother wolf had started pacing around noon, not aggressively, but with purpose, moving from window to window as if checking something. Her hackles would rise periodically, and a low growl would rumble from her chest. "What is it?" Nora asked, knowing it was ridiculous to expect an answer. "What do you hear?" The wolf went to the east window and growled louder. Nora joined her, wiping condensation from the glass. At first, she saw nothing but the storm. Then the lightning flashed, and she caught a glimpse of the tree line. Something was wrong with the snow patterns. Instead of the random drifts you'd expect, there were circular shapes. Perfect circles, like something had been moving in deliberate patterns around the cabin. The tracks were enormous, easily twice the size of the mother wolf's paws. "That's not possible," Nora whispered. Another flash. The circles were closer now. Multiple sets, all moving in the same clockwise pattern. The mother wolf's growl deepened to something that made Nora's stomach clench. This was the sound of a predator facing something it considered a threat, something worth fighting, but the wolf wasn't looking at the tracks. She was looking above them at the trees themselves. Nora followed her gaze. In the next lightning flash, she saw it. Carved into the bark of a massive pine, about 30 yards from the cabin, was a symbol. A circle with radiating lines, fresh enough that sap still wept from the cuts despite the cold. the exact same symbol that appeared on page 47 of her grandmother's journal. Nora's hands were shaking as she retrieved the journal. Flipped to the entry. There was the symbol, sketched in her grandmother's careful hand. Below it, a single word, guardian's mark. No explanation, no context. Just that phrase and a date, July 15th, 1963. What does it mean? Nora asked the empty cabin. The storm answered with another crash of thunder that shook the floor. She spent the afternoon trying to make sense of it, read through the journal cover to cover, looking for any other mention of the symbol, of guardians, of anything that might explain what was happening. Most of the journal was practical. Plant identification, weather patterns, trail maps. But scattered throughout were these other entries, brief, cryptic, like, her grandmother had been leaving breadcrumbs. For someone who knew how to follow them, the old ones say the mountain has a memory longer than trees. April 1958. Some bargains are made with blood, others with silence. Both matter. October 1961. When the marks appear, the door must be opened. Refusal has consequences. March 1964, that last one made Nora go cold. When the marks appear, the door must be opened. She'd opened the door. Let the wolves in. But had that been a choice, or had something compelled it? Had the mother wolf known somehow that Nora would open that door? Round 4 in the afternoon, the pups woke and started exploring. They were steadier on their feet now, curiosity overcoming their exhaustion. Silver stuck close to the mother wolf, but Shadow and Ember began investigating the cabin with the fearlessness of the very young. Nora watched them sniff at her boots, investigate the legs of the table, wrestle with each other on the rug. They looked like normal wolf pups, played like normal pups. But every so often, one would pause and look at her with that same intense awareness she'd seen in their mother's eyes, like they were studying her, learning her. She found some jerky in her supplies, tore it into small pieces. The mother wolf watched as Nora offered some to the pups. Shadow took it immediately, gulping it down. Ember was more cautious, sniffing first. Silver wouldn't take it from Nora's hand, waited until she set it on the floor, then darted forward to grab it. Smart, Nora murmured. Don't trust too easy. When she offered a piece to the mother wolf, the animal considered for a long moment before accepting it with surprising gentleness. Her teeth barely grazed Nora's fingers. That night the sounds started, not the wind or thunder, though both continued their assault. Something else. Something that made the mother wolf go rigid and position herself between the door and her pups. It sounded like scratching, slow, deliberate. Like something with claws was testing the cabin walls, looking for a way in. The mother wolf began to howl, deep, rhythmic, almost like a song. And from somewhere outside, muffled by the storm, but unmistakable, other voices answered. The pack, calling to each other through the chaos, but there was another sound underneath, lower, wrong, like the echo of the howls but distorted, as if something was trying to mimic them without quite understanding how. Nora grabbed the flashlight, went to the window. She needed to see what was out there, needed to understand what had driven these wolves to seek shelter with a human. The lightning flashed, and for one crystalline moment, she saw it. Between the trees, something moved. Not an animal, not human, just shadow, darker than the surrounding night, absorbing the lightning's flash instead of reflecting it. It was shaped wrong, moved wrong, existed wrong, and it was circling the cabin. The mother wolf's howl changed pitch, becoming more urgent. The pups huddled together, whimpering. Nora stood frozen at the window, flashlight beams swallowed by the darkness, every rational explanation crumbling under the weight of what her eyes were telling her. The mountain had a memory. Her grandmother had written that, and something in that memory had woken up. The storm finally broke on the 5th day. Nora woke to silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. No wind, no thunder. Just the occasional creak of ice-laden branches and the soft breathing of the wolves. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows, turning the world outside into a landscape of pristine white and impossible beauty. Snowdrifts reached the eaves in places. The trees looked like sculptures, Every branch weighted with ice that caught the light and threw it back in prisms. It was breathtaking. It was also terrifying. 5 days trapped in the cabin with 4 wild animals and whatever had been circling outside. 5 days of rationing food, keeping the fire burning, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. The wolves had stayed calm through most of it. During the day, they'd been almost peaceful. The pups playing, the mother wolf resting or watching through the windows. But every night, when the scratching started and those wrong-sounding howls echoed through the darkness, the mother wolf would position herself at the door and sing her warning to whatever lurked outside. And every night, Nora had stood at the window with her flashlight, catching glimpses of things that her mind refused to fully process. Shadows that moved independently of any light source. Shapes that seemed to shift and blur at the edges. Tracks in the snow that appeared and disappeared between one lightning flash and the next. Now, in the clean light of morning, she could finally see what had been surrounding her cabin. The circular tracks were everywhere. Dozens of them, layered over each other, forming complex patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost ritualistic. And every 30 feet or so, carved into the bark of a tree, was that same symbol. The Guardian's mark. Nora pulled on her boots, her warmest coat, grabbed a walking stick from beside the door. The mother wolf watched her with obvious concern, a low whine building in her throat. "I need to see," Nora said. "I need to understand what's happening." The wolf moved to block the door. "I'll be careful," Nora promised. "I'm just going to look at the trees." That's all. Whether the wolf understood or simply recognized futility, she stepped aside. But as Nora opened the door, the wolf pushed past her, the pups scrambling to follow. "No, you should stay." But they were already outside, shaking snow off their coats. Looking around with alert curiosity, the mother wolf took point, moving ahead of Nora with obvious purpose. Leading her, the snow was deeper than Nora expected, coming up past her knees in places. But the mother wolf seemed to know where the ground was more solid, picking a path that Nora could follow. They reached the first marked tree. Up close, the symbol was even more disturbing. The cuts were deep, made with something sharp enough to slice through bark cleanly. But there was no debris around the base of the tree, no wood chips or shavings. Just the mark itself, precise and impossibly clean. Nora reached out to touch it. The sap that wept from the cuts was wrong, too dark, almost black, with a smell like copper and something else. Something that made her stomach turn. The mother wolf nudged Nora's hand away from the tree, gently but firmly. "Message received, don't touch." They continued the circuit. Every marked tree showed the same pattern. Same depth of cut, same black sap, same wrongness. And in the center of one of the circular track patterns, Nora found something else. A stone, smooth, black, about the size of her fist. It had a natural hole through the center, perfectly round, as if water had worn through it over centuries. The mother wolf sat down beside it and looked at Nora expectantly. "You want me to take it?" The wolf's tail swished once through the snow. Nora picked up the stone. It was heavier than it looked and oddly warm despite the cold. She held it up, looked through the hole, and nearly dropped it. Through the hole, the world looked different. The shadows were darker, yes, but they also had shape, substance. And between the trees, she could see them. Dozens of them. Those wrong-shaped things that had been circling her cabin, now standing perfectly still, watching. She lowered the stone quickly, heart hammering. Through normal vision, the forest was empty, beautiful and serene and completely ordinary. She raised the stone again. "The shadows were still there, waiting. What are they?" she whispered. The mother wolf stood and began walking back toward the cabin. The pups followed immediately, with Silver casting one backward glance at Nora that seemed to carry a warning. "Come now." Nora didn't argue. She clutched the stone and hurried after them, trying not to think about what she'd seen, trying not to imagine those things moving closer when she wasn't looking. Back inside the cabin, Nora went straight to the journal, flipped through pages with shaking hands until she found what she was looking for. Page 73, a sketch of a stone with a hole through it, and below it, binding stone. Shows what watches. Use with caution. Some things are easier unseen, her grandmother had known. Had known about the marks, about the stones, about whatever those shadow things were. The entry continued. The old protection holds, but it weakens with each generation. The guardians remain as long as someone remembers the bargain. But memory fades, and with it, the barriers between what is and what waits. Guardians. Nora looked at the mother wolf, who had settled near the stove with her pups. "You're the guardians," Nora said slowly. "You and your pack. You guard against those things." The wolf's ears perked forward, listening, but something's changed. The barriers are weakening. That's why the storm came. That's why those things were able to get close. She was talking to a wolf like it could understand complex sentences. And the truly crazy part was that the wolf seemed to be following along. When Nora paused, the mother wolf made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. "Agreement, maybe, or confirmation, and you came to me because—" Nora stopped. The journal was still open in her hands. She read the next line. "The keeper must shelter the pack when darkness gathers. Blood calls to blood, and the mountain does not forget its debts. Keeper." That word again, blood calls to blood. Nora's grandmother had lived here, had written these entries, had known about the guardians and the barriers and the things that waited in the shadows. And Nora was her granddaughter. Knock on the door made her jump so badly she almost dropped the journal. The mother wolf was on her feet instantly, a growl rumbling. But this was different from her reaction to the shadow things. This was wariness, not outright threat. Another knock. Then a familiar voice. "Nora? You alive in there?" Kit, her neighbor. Nora opened the door to find Kit standing on the porch, looking worse for wear. She had ice in her hair, dark circles under her eyes, and her snowmobile was covered in fresh powder behind her. Kit's eyes went straight past Nora to the wolves. "Oh," she said quietly. "So it's happening again." "Again?" Nora stepped aside to let Kit in, though the mother wolf was clearly not happy about it. "You know about this?" Kit pulled off her gloves, her gaze moving between Nora and the wolves, with something that looked like resignation. "Know about it? My sister was supposed to be the keeper 20 years ago. The wolves came to her during a storm just like this one. What happened to her?" "She ran." Kit's voice was flat. "Packed up, left the mountain, swore she'd never come back. 3 weeks later, she drove off a bridge in Montana. No skid marks, no explanation." She looked at Nora. "The mountain doesn't let go once it chooses you." Nora felt cold despite the warmth of the cabin. "Chooses me for what?" "To keep the bargain." Kit moved to the window, careful to give the mother wolf space. Every few generations the barriers weaken. The things below start pushing through. The wolves, the guardian pack. They're the first line of defense, but they can't do it alone. They need a human anchor, someone who can channel the old power, strengthen the seal. What seal? "The one your grandmother's sister died maintaining." Kit turned back to Nora. "You found the binding stone. That means you're already deeper in than my sister ever got. The wolves trust you." Nora looked at the mother wolf, who was watching this exchange with those two intelligent eyes. "I just let them in from the storm." "No," Kit said gently. "You made a choice. The door, the shelter, the trust, those were choices. And the mountain witnessed them." She gestured to the window, to the symbols carved in the trees. "Those marks? They're not warnings. They're confirmations. You're the keeper now, whether you want to be or not." The pups had gathered around Nora's feet, looking up at her. Silver Shadow Ember, 3 small lives that depended on decisions she didn't understand. "What if I say no?" Nora asked. "What if I'm not ready for this?" Kit's expression softened with something like pity. "Then those things in the shadows break through. The seal fails, and the darkness spreads beyond the mountain." She paused. "But more than that, you'll carry what my sister carried. The weight of knowing you could have stood when it mattered, and you chose to run instead." Nora thought about the boy under the bridge, the case she'd failed, the guilt that had driven her to this mountain in the first place. She'd come here to escape responsibility, to hide from the weight of other people's lives. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. "How much time do I have?" she asked quietly. "Until the full moon. That's when the ritual has to happen." Kit checked her watch. 7 days. 7 days to learn how to be something she didn't understand. 7 days to prepare for a ritual she'd never heard of. 7 days to decide if she could live with herself if she walked away. The mother wolf moved closer, pressed her massive head against Nora's leg. The gesture was unmistakable. Trust, alliance, please. Nora placed her hand on the wolf's head, felt the warmth and strength there. "Tell me everything," she said to Kit. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." Kit nodded slowly. "You're going to need to sit down for this." Outside, through the window, Nora could see the shadows between the trees, waiting, watching. The choice had been made when she opened the door. Now she had to live with it. Kit made coffee while Nora fed the wood stove. The pups had settled down after their initial wariness, though Shadow still watched Kit with suspicious eyes. The mother wolf had taken up position where she could see both women, relaxed but alert. "Your grandmother's sister was named Margaret, too," Kit began, cradling her mug. "Margaret Eleanor Winslow. She was 23 when the last convergence happened. That's what the old ones call it. When the barriers thin and the sealed things start pushing through." "What things?" Nora asked. "Those shadows I saw, what are they?" "Nobody knows exactly what they are. The tribal elders have stories that go back centuries, entities that existed before humans came to these mountains. Things that lived in the deep places, the caves and crevasses that go down farther than anyone's ever mapped. They're not ghosts, not demons. Just old, hungry. They feed on life, on warmth, on light. Everything they touch withers." Kit pulled out a folded piece of paper from her jacket. It was a photocopy of a newspaper article, yellowed and creased. "Local woman dies in tragic accident," the headline read. The article was dated September 1963. "She succeeded," Kit said quietly. "Margaret Eleanor performed the ritual, strengthened the seal, pushed the entities back. But it cost her everything. She died 3 days later from wounds sustained during the ceremony. Your grandmother was the one who found her." Nora looked at the grainy photo accompanying the article. A young woman with familiar eyes, her grandmother's eyes, her own eyes, smiling at the camera. "So much life in that face, so much that would be lost. My grandmother never came back here after that," Nora said. "She moved to Spokane, became a nurse, never talked about the mountain. Can you blame her?" Kit set down her mug. She watched her sister die for a responsibility that was supposed to be shared between them. "But your grandmother was pregnant at the time with your mother. She couldn't risk it. So Margaret Eleanor stood alone." The mother wolf made a soft sound, almost like she was following the conversation. "Mourning, maybe, for a keeper long dead. The wolves would have been there," Nora said, understanding. "They would have fought alongside her. The guardians always stand with the keeper. That's the bargain, human and wolf working together to maintain the seal. But the keeper bears the heaviest burden. The ritual requires human blood to anchor it, human will to channel the power." Kit looked at Nora steadily. "You need to understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't symbolic. It's dangerous. People die doing this, but not everyone," Nora said. "You said every few generations. There must have been keepers who survived. Some, the ones who had strong packs, good preparation, and maybe a little luck." Kit stood, moved to the window. "My sister could have been one of them. The wolves came to her just like they came to you. But she was scared, and I don't blame her for that. Being chosen doesn't mean you're ready." Nora thought about her own fear, the way her hands still shook when she thought about those shadow things lurking between the trees. "How do I get ready?" "First, you need to understand what you're dealing with." Kit pulled out the binding stone from Nora's pocket. Nora hadn't even realized she'd been carrying it. "Look through this. Really look. You need to see them clearly." Nora raised the stone to her eye, peered through the natural hole. The cabin looked the same through the stone. Same walls, same stove, same furniture. But when she turned to look outside, her breath caught. The shadows were closer than they'd been before. Much closer. They ringed the cabin in a loose circle, maybe 20 feet from the walls. And they weren't formless anymore. Through the stone, she could see details. They were vaguely humanoid but wrong in proportions. Too tall, limbs too long, movements too fluid. Where their faces should be was just emptiness, but she could feel them watching, waiting. "There are dozens of them," Nora whispered. "More every day as the moon grows fuller. The seal is weakening, and they're drawn to the breach like moths to flame." Kit's voice was steady, giving Nora an anchor. "But they can't cross onto your property, not yet. The wolves' presence creates a barrier, small, temporary, but real." Nora lowered the stone. Through normal vision, the forest looked peaceful, innocent. "How long will that hold?" "Until the full moon. Then either you perform the ritual and strengthen the seal, or—" Kit didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The rest of that day was spent in preparation. Kit had brought supplies, salt, specific herbs that grew only in certain elevations, candles made from beeswax, and something else Nora didn't recognize. She'd also brought books, or more accurately, photocopies of books. Pages worn soft from multiple readings. "This is everything the tribal elders were willing to share," Kit said, spreading the papers across Nora's table. "Combined with what was in your grandmother's journal, it should be enough. Should be." Not exactly a confident assertion. The ritual itself was complex. It required the keeper to mark 4 cardinal points around the seal's location, which, according to Kit, was in an old mine shaft about 2 miles from Nora's cabin. At each point, the keeper would need to draw blood and speak specific words in a language Nora didn't recognize. "It's older than English," Kit explained. "Older than any language spoken today. The elders say it's the first tongue, the words that shape the world. You don't have to understand them. You just have to say them correctly and mean them. Mean them how? With everything you have. Half-hearted doesn't work. The ritual feeds on conviction, on will, on the absolute certainty that they're not mindless," Kit explained as they stood at the window, watching the shadows through the stone. "They're intelligent, patient. They've been sealed away for generations. They can wait a few more days to find the weak points." Nora learned to use the binding stone, not just to see, but to push back. It required focus, Will, the same kind of mental discipline she'd used in her social work when dealing with volatile situations. "Ground yourself, stay calm." Project authority. When she concentrated while looking through the stone, the shadows would retreat slightly. "Not much, just a foot or 2. But it was something good," Kit said. "That's the keeper's power. The ability to impose order on chaos, to draw lines and make them hold. The ritual will amplify that 1,000-fold, but you need the foundation first." The mother wolf participated in the training in her own way. She would lead Nora on walks around the property, always choosing paths that brought them near the marked trees. Teaching her, Nora realized to recognize the symbols, to understand the geography of the barrier. The pups came too, growing stronger each day. They were changing, not just growing, but developing in ways that seemed too fast. Silver, the smallest, had started to glow faintly in darkness. Ember's eyes had shifted from blue to amber gold. Shadow could disappear into darkness so completely that even Nora's trained eye lost track of him. "Their guardian wolves," Kit said when Nora mentioned it. "Not entirely natural. The old power runs through them, just like it'll run through you during the ritual. They're your allies in this. Treat them as equals, not pets." Nora had never thought of them as pets. The mother wolf especially commanded too much respect for that. But understanding they were something more, something other, changed the dynamic. On the 3rd day of training, Vernon appeared on a snowmobile bringing supplies and news. "Highway patrols asking questions," he said. "Accepting coffee with gnarled hands." Hikers went missing on the north face. 3 of them. Search and rescue found their tent, their gear, everything except the people. "The entities?" Nora asked. Vernon's eyes moved to the wolves, then back to Nora. "So it's true. You're the new keeper." He didn't sound surprised. "Found their bodies this morning. Frozen solid, but that's not what killed them. They looked drained, like all the life had been sucked out." Nora felt sick. Could the seal breaking do that? Kill people? It's not broken yet. But it's cracked enough for the entities to slip through if someone wanders too close to the weak points. Vernon set down his mug. "You need to finish this, girl. Those hikers won't be the last if this goes on much longer." After Vernon left, Nora stood at the window with the binding stone, watching the shadows. They seemed agitated now, moving faster, pressing closer to the barrier the wolves maintained. They knew time was running short, and they were getting bolder. 4 days until the full moon. 4 days to prepare for something she barely understood. To save a mountain she'd come to seeking escape. The mother wolf pressed against her leg, warm and solid and real. Nora placed her hand on the wolf's head. "We can do this," she said, trying to believe it. "Together." The wolf's answering rumble might have been agreement, or it might have been doubt. The cellar was something Nora hadn't fully explored since moving in. Just a small space accessed through a trapdoor in the cabin floor, used mostly for storing root vegetables and canned goods. She'd been down there twice, once when she first arrived, once to retrieve a jar of pickles in October. But on the 4th day of training, the mother wolf became insistent. She stood at the trapdoor, pawing at it, whining in a way that demanded attention. "What is it?" Nora asked, though expecting an answer was still strange. "What's down there?" The wolf looked at her with those amber eyes, then back at the trapdoor. The message was clear. Open it. Kit had gone back to her cabin for supplies, leaving Nora alone with the wolves. The pups gathered around as Nora pulled up the trapdoor, revealing wooden steps leading down into darkness. The smell that rose up was earthy and old, with an undertone of something else. Cedar, maybe, or sage. Nora grabbed a flashlight and descended carefully. The mother wolf followed immediately, her bulk filling the narrow stairway. At the bottom, Nora swung the flashlight beam around. The cellar was larger than she'd thought. The part she'd seen before was just the entrance. Beyond it, the space opened up into what looked like a natural cave extension, shored up with old timber supports, and in the back corner, covered with a tarp, was something large. The mother wolf went straight to it, sat down and waited. Nora approached slowly, pulled back the tarp. It was a chest. Old wood, bound with iron, the kind of thing that belonged in a museum or a period film. The lock was gone, the hasp hanging loose. Nora lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, was a cloak. She lifted it out carefully. The material was soft, despite its age, made from wolf pelts stitched together with leather thongs and what looked like sinew. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each pelt chosen to create a pattern, dark and light greys flowing into blacks and silvers. It was beautiful. It was also deeply unsettling. "This is what the keeper wears," Nora said quietly. "Isn't it?" The mother wolf's tail swept the dirt floor once. Yes, beneath the cloak were other items. A knife with an obsidian blade and a handle carved from bone. Wolf bone, Nora realized with a chill. A leather pouch containing dried herbs. A smaller journal, its pages brittle with age. Nora opened the journal carefully. The handwriting was different from her grandmother's, older, more ornate. The first entry was dated June 1963. "My name is Margaret Eleanor Winslow, and if you're reading this, I am likely dead. Do not mourn me. I chose this path knowing the cost. But I would not leave you, whoever you are, to face this burden unprepared." The entries that followed were instructions. Detailed, practical, written by someone who knew she might not survive to pass on the knowledge in person. Margaret Eleanor had been thorough. She described the ritual in terms that made sense, explained the purpose of each element, warned about the dangers. She'd even sketched diagrams showing the layout of the mine, the location of the seal, the position of the cardinal points. "The entities will try to stop you," one entry read. "They will manifest physically if they must. This is why the guardian wolves are essential. They can fight what human weapons cannot touch. Trust them. They have protected keepers for longer than any of us have lived." Another entry near the end. "The blade must pierce the seal's center at the moment of peak power. Your blood on the blade, the wolves' strength channeling through you. The old words spoken with absolute conviction. These 3 things will restore the barrier for another generation. But know this, the blade will take as much as you're willing to give. Hold nothing back, or it will take everything anyway and fail regardless." The final entry was dated 3 days before Margaret Eleanor's death. "I am afraid. I would be lying if I claimed otherwise. But fear is not weakness. It is simply proof that we understand what we risk. The question is not whether we are afraid, but whether we act despite the fear. I have chosen to act. May whoever follows me find the same courage when their time comes. Nora sat back on her heels, the journal trembling in her hands. This woman, her great-aunt, someone whose blood she shared, had faced this exact choice, had walked into that mine knowing she might not walk out, had done it anyway because it was right. I'm not that brave, Nora whispered to the mother wolf. I'm not like her. The wolf moved closer, pressed her massive head against Nora's shoulder. The weight was comforting, grounding. Nora thought about why she'd come to the mountain, running from failure, from guilt, from the weight of responsibility she hadn't been able to carry. But maybe running and being chosen weren't mutually exclusive. Maybe the mountain had called to her precisely because she understood failure, because she knew what it meant to make the wrong choice and live with the consequences. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Nora carried the chest's contents upstairs, laid the cloak out on her bed, placed the knife and journal beside it. The pups gathered around, sniffing at the items with obvious recognition. These were pack objects, sacred objects. When Kit returned that evening, she stopped in the doorway and went very still. You found Margaret Eleanor's ritual gear, she said quietly. That's good. That's really good, is it? Nora touched the cloak's soft fur. Or is it just proof that I'm about to follow in the footsteps of someone who died doing this? She didn't fail, Kit said firmly. She succeeded. The seal held for 60 years because of what she did. Those hikers who died this week, without Margaret Eleanor's sacrifice, that would have been everyone on this mountain decades ago. She moved closer. You're not being asked to do something no one has survived. You're being asked to do what others have done successfully, with better preparation than most of them had. Better preparation. Kit gestured around the cabin. You have me. You have Vernon, who knows more about the mountain's history than anyone alive. You have your great-aunt's journal, her tools, her experience written down. And most importantly, you have them. She nodded toward the wolves. The mother wolf had positioned herself so she could see both women, while the pups had sprawled near the stove in a heap of grey fur and contentment. Margaret Eleanor had guardian wolves too, Nora said. They fought beside her. It still wasn't enough to save her. No, Kit admitted, but she chose to give everything. That was her decision. You might make a different one. The ritual requires blood and will, but it doesn't demand death. Some keepers have survived by being more measured, by holding back just enough to endure while still giving enough to succeed. Margaret Eleanor's journal says, holding back causes the ritual to fail. Margaret Eleanor was young and thought in absolutes. Kit sat down at the table, her expression thoughtful. I've talked to the tribal elders. They have records of other keepers, other rituals. The successful ones, the ones who lived, they understood balance. Push too hard, you burn out. Hold back too much, the ritual fails. The sweet spot is narrow, but it exists. Nora wanted to believe that, wanted to think she could be smart enough, balanced enough to thread that needle. But she also remembered the shadow things pressing against the barriers, the drained bodies of the hikers. The way the mother wolf's howls had sounded desperate those first nights. Whatever was sealed beneath the mountain, it was powerful enough to inspire terror in creatures that were themselves supernatural. That kind of threat didn't respond to measured half-efforts. Tell me about the mine, Nora said, changing the subject. I need to see it before the ritual. Understand the space. We can go tomorrow, Kit said. It's about 2 miles northeast. Old silver mine from the 1880s, played out by 1900. The main shaft goes down about 200 feet, then connects to natural cave systems that go much deeper. The seal is in a chamber at the connection point, where human excavation meets the mountain's bones. And the entities are below that? Far below. Miles maybe. The old stories say they've always been there, in the deepest dark, where the mountain's roots reach down into the earth's core. The seal doesn't destroy them, it just keeps them contained. That night, Nora tried on the cloak. It fit perfectly, settling on her shoulders like it had been made for her. The weight was substantial but not uncomfortable. The fur was warm against her skin. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. A stranger looked back, someone wild, someone who belonged to the mountain rather than civilization. The mother wolf approached, sniffed at the cloak, then made a sound that might have been approval. "Do I look ridiculous?" Nora asked. The wolf sat down, tilted her head, and Nora could have sworn the animal was amused. "Right, talking to wolves about my appearance. I've completely lost it," but she hadn't, and she knew it. She was changing, yes, but into something that made sense in ways her old life never had. Social worker trying to save the world one case at a time, burning out because the need was infinite and her capacity was not. This was different. This was specific, concrete. One task, one night, one chance to do something that mattered in a way that couldn't be measured in case files and court orders. She could do this. She had to. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days to visit the mine, finalize the preparations, steel herself for what was coming. 3 days to become someone capable of standing against the darkness and holding the line. Nora took off the cloak, folded it carefully. Outside, the night was clear for the first time in a week. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the sky, like diamonds on black velvet, and between the trees, through the binding stone that she'd started carrying everywhere, the shadows waited and watched. The choice had been made. Now came the hard part, following through. They set out for the mine at first light, 3 days before the full moon. Nora, Kit, and the 4 wolves, a strange procession moving through snow-covered forest that sparkled in the morning sun. The pups were growing at an impossible rate. What should have taken months was happening in days. They were nearly half the mother wolf's size now, their movements more coordinated, their awareness sharper. Silver stayed close to Nora, while Shadow and Ember ranged ahead with Kit, scouting the path. The mine entrance was less dramatic than Nora had expected. Just a dark opening in a rocky hillside, shored up with ancient timbers that looked like they might collapse at any moment. Snow had drifted against the entrance, but not inside. The darkness beyond was absolute. "The tribal elder is meeting us here," Kit said, checking her watch. "He wanted to perform a blessing before you went inside." Nora was about to ask why, when she heard the sound of an approaching snowmobile. An older man appeared through the trees, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew these trails intimately. Thomas Running Bear was probably 70, with long grey hair braided down his back and a face that carried the weight of considerable knowledge. He shut off the snowmobile and approached slowly, giving the wolves time to assess him. The mother wolf watched him carefully but didn't growl. Some kind of recognition passed between them, elder to elder, guardian to guardian. "So you're Margaret's granddaughter," Thomas said, his voice carrying the rhythms of someone who chose words carefully. "You have her eyes. Her spirit too, I think. You knew my grandmother. I knew both Margarets. Your grandmother who left, and her sister who stayed." He pulled a worn photograph from his jacket and handed it to Nora. This was taken in the summer of 1963, a month before the ritual. Nora's hands trembled as she looked at the photo. 2 women stood in front of a cabin. This cabin, she realized, with wolves gathered around them. One woman was clearly pregnant, her hand resting on her belly. The other stood slightly apart, her expression serious and determined, but it was the second woman in the background that made Nora's breath catch. "That's my grandmother," she said, pointing to the pregnant woman. "But who?" She stopped, looked closer. The second woman looked exactly like her grandmother. "Not similar, identical. They were twins," Thomas said quietly. "Your grandmother Margaret and her sister Margaret Eleanor, born 3 minutes apart on the spring equinox. The mountain recognizes certain bloodlines, and twins, especially those born on sacred days, carry double the connection." Kit's sharp intake of breath told Nora she hadn't known this either. "My mother never mentioned," Nora began. "Your grandmother never told her," Thomas interrupted gently. "After Margaret Eleanor died, your grandmother left and tried to forget everything about this place. She changed her life, became someone new, raised your mother far from the mountain. She thought she could break the cycle by keeping silent. Nora stared at the photograph. Her grandmother looked so young, so scared. And Margaret Eleanor, her great-aunt, her grandmother's twin, looked resigned, like she'd already accepted what was coming. "The mountain doesn't forget blood debts," Thomas continued. "Margaret Eleanor chose to stand alone because her sister was pregnant, vulnerable. She took the full burden of the ritual, knowing it would likely kill her. And it did. But before she died, she made your grandmother promise something." "What promise?" "That if the mountain ever called again, someone from the bloodline would answer." Thomas looked at the wolves, then back at Nora. "Your grandmother tried to protect you by staying away, by never speaking of this place. But the mountain is patient. It waited for the right moment, the right person. And when you needed somewhere to run, it called you here." Nora felt cold despite her heavy coat. "You're saying this was planned? That I was manipulated into coming here?" "Not manipulated, guided." Thomas gestured at the forest around them. "The mountain doesn't force, it offers. You needed healing, needed distance from pain you couldn't process in the city. The cabin was here, waiting. You made the choice to come. And the wolves? The storm? Opening my door, was any of that my choice?" The mother wolf moved to Nora's side, pressed against her leg. "The touch was warm, solid, real. The storm was the barrier weakening," Thomas said. "The wolves seeking shelter was their survival instinct. But you opening the door, that was entirely your choice. You could have left them outside. Many would have. But you didn't, and that choice revealed your character." Nora thought about that night. The terror and the compassion warring inside her. The moment she'd decided that letting wolves die on her porch was worse than the risk of letting them inside. "Kit said the mountain chooses keepers," Nora said slowly. "But it sounds like my family was chosen a long time ago." "That I'm only here because of blood. Blood opens the door," Thomas agreed. "But character walks through it. Your great-aunt could have run. Your grandmother did run. He paused, studying her. "You're still deciding." The truth of that hit hard. She'd been training, preparing, going through the motions. But had she truly committed? Or was she just doing what seemed necessary until she could find a way out? "I need to see the seal," Nora said abruptly. "I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with." Thomas nodded. "That's why I'm here, to guide you down and back up safely. But first," he pulled a leather pouch from his jacket, began laying out items on a flat rock. "Sage, cedar, tobacco. First, we ask permission from the mountain and the old powers. We don't take this journey lightly." The blessing ceremony was simple but profound. Thomas sang in a language Nora didn't understand, his voice carrying through the still air. The wolves sat in a semicircle, watching with obvious respect. When he finished, he marked Nora's forehead with ash and spoke directly to her. "The darkness below is older than humanity. It doesn't hate us. We're not significant enough for that. It simply hungers, and it will consume anything in its path if released. The seal is all that stands between the deep hunger and the world. Above, do you understand?" "Yes, then let's go down." The mine shaft was pitch black beyond the first few feet. Thomas had brought powerful LED lanterns that pushed back the darkness, revealing rough-hewn walls and ancient support timbers. The air was cold and damp, carrying a mineral smell and something underneath, something wrong. They descended carefully, the wolves moving with sure-footed grace. The shaft went down at a steep angle, switching back on itself every 50 feet or so. Nora counted the turns. 4, 5, 6. At the 7th turn, the mine shaft opened into a natural cavern. The space was enormous. The lantern light couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. But in the center, clearly visible, was the seal. It looked like a massive circular platform of stone, maybe 20 feet in diameter, raised about 3 feet off the cave floor. The surface was covered in carved symbols, some Nora recognized from the trees, others completely alien. And running through it, like cracks in ice, were lines of pulsing red light. The seal was breaking. Visibly, actively deteriorating. "It's worse than I thought," Thomas said quietly. "The convergence is accelerating." Nora approached the platform. The closer she got, the more she could feel it, a pressure against her skin, a wrongness in the air that made her teeth ache. Through the cracks, she could see deeper darkness. And movement, don't look directly into the cracks, Thomas warned. What's below will look back, too late. Nora had already leaned forward, peering into one of the wider fissures. Something looked up at her, not with eyes. It didn't have eyes. But she felt its attention lock onto her like a physical weight. Felt its hunger, vast and patient and utterly without mercy. It had been waiting down there for generations, and it would wait generations more if necessary. Time meant nothing to it, but the seal was failing. And soon time wouldn't matter. Nora jerked back, gasping. The mother wolf was there immediately, pushing between her and the seal, forcing her to step away. "I told you not to look," Thomas said, but his tone was understanding rather than reproaching. "Now you know what's at stake. Those things killed the hikers. Given freedom, they would drain this entire mountain of life within a year. Then they'd spread. Slowly at first, then faster. Within a generation, they could consume half the continent, but the ritual will stop them. The ritual will repair the seal. Strengthen it by another 60 years, maybe more if done correctly." Thomas moved to the platform's edge, pointing at specific areas. "You'll need to mark these 4 cardinal points with blood. Speak the old words at each one. Then stand in the center and drive the obsidian blade through the seal's heart at the moment of maximum lunar alignment. And that will work?" It has worked. Every time a keeper has performed it correctly, the seal has held. He paused. "The question is always cost. How much of yourself are you willing to give?" Nora thought about Margaret Eleanor, about the choice her great-aunt had made. "Everything," she said quietly. "If that's what it takes, everything might not be necessary," Thomas said carefully. "But you must be willing. The ritual reads intent. Hesitation causes failure more surely than any technical error. They stayed in the cavern for another hour. Thomas showed Nora exactly where to stand, where to cut, what words to speak. He explained the timing. The full moon would reach its apex at 11:47 p.m. 3 nights from now. The ritual needed to begin exactly 30 minutes before that, giving her time to mark the 4 points before the final moment. "The wolves will fight to protect you," Thomas said. "The entities will try to stop the ritual. They'll manifest physically, use every trick they know to break your concentration. But if you hold firm, if you complete the ritual, regardless of what happens around you, the seal will hold." On the way back up, Nora was quiet, processing everything she'd learned. Git walked beside her, equally thoughtful. It wasn't until they reached the surface, until the clean mountain air hit her face, that Nora finally spoke. "My grandmother knew this would happen eventually, that someone from our family would be called back." "Probably," Kit agreed. "She could have warned my mother. Good have prepared her, prepared me." Instead, she kept silent and hoped the mountain would forget. Can you blame her? She watched her twin sister die down there. Nora looked at the photograph Thomas had let her keep. 2 women, identical in appearance but different in fate. One who ran and one who stood. One who lived with guilt and one who died with purpose. "No," she said finally. "I can't blame her, but I won't be her. I won't run and leave someone else to face this burden." The mother wolf made a sound, approval maybe, or recognition. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days to prepare for the fight of her life, but now she knew exactly what she was fighting for, and exactly what it would cost if she failed. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, more substantial. Waiting, watching, Nora pulled the wolf pelt cloak tighter around her shoulders and headed back toward the cabin. There was work to do. The 2 days before the full moon passed. In a blur of preparation and mounting tension, Nora spent hours with Margaret Eleanor's journal, memorizing the ritual words until she could recite them in her sleep. The language was harsh, guttural, nothing like anything she'd studied in school. Thomas had helped with pronunciation, correcting her until each syllable came out precisely right. "These aren't just words," he'd explained. "They're commands. Older than this mountain, older than the entities below. Speak them wrong, and they have no power. Speak them right, and they reshape reality itself." No pressure there. Kit helped gather the final materials. The salt had to be from a specific source, sea salt, ironically, carried all the way from the Pacific coast by traders a century ago and kept in the general store's back room. Vernon had known exactly where to find it, like he'd been waiting for this request. "Your great-aunt used this same batch," he'd said, handling the ancient container carefully. "Salt doesn't go bad. Power doesn't fade. Use what she consecrated. The herbs were equally specific. Sage from the high meadows, cedar from trees that grew near running water, tobacco blessed by the tribal elders. Each one had to be prepared in a particular way, dried, bundled, tied with natural fiber. Nora's hands learned the rhythms of the work, folding, tying, checking against the journal's diagrams. Her mind was quieter when her hands were busy. Less time to think about what was coming. The wolves understood something was approaching. The mother wolf. Nora had started thinking of her as Silverthread, a name that came to her in a dream, had become increasingly vigilant. She positioned herself by the door most of the time, ears constantly swiveling, tracking sounds Nora couldn't hear. The pups were restless too. Shadow had taken to disappearing for hours at a time, scouting the perimeter. Ember stayed close to Kit, following her like a large grey shadow. And Silver, sweet, nervous Silver, barely left Nora's side, pressing against her leg whenever the anxiety got too high. "They know what's coming," Kit said, watching the wolves' pace. "They've probably been through this before, generations ago. It's in their blood, their instincts. Does that make it easier or harder for them?" Nora asked. "Both, probably. They know it's necessary. They also know it's dangerous." The entity activity had increased dramatically. Through the binding stone, Nora could see them gathering in greater numbers each day. They ringed the cabin in a thick, dark mass, pressing against the invisible barrier the wolves maintained. Sometimes they would rush forward in unison, testing the boundary, retreating when the mother wolf, when Silverthread, howled her warning. They were getting bolder, more aggressive. Time was running out, and they knew it. On the evening before the ritual, Vernon came to the cabin one last time. He brought food, proper food, the kind meant for a significant meal. Fresh bread, venison he'd smoked himself, vegetables from someone's root cellar, even a bottle of wine that looked older than Nora. "Margaret Eleanor ate a good meal the night before," he said, unpacking the supplies. "Your grandmother insisted on it. Said if she was going to risk everything, she'd do it on a full stomach." They ate together around Nora's small table. Nora, Kit, Vernon, Thomas, who had arrived just after sunset. The wolves got their share too, venison scraps that they accepted with surprising delicacy. It felt like a last supper, and maybe it was. The conversation stayed light, deliberately avoiding the topic of tomorrow night. They talked about weather, about the mountain's history, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. When the meal was finished and Vernon and Thomas had left, promising to return tomorrow to stand watch, Kit pulled out a small wooden box. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this," she said. "She gave it to my sister before everything. Told her to keep it safe and give it to whoever the mountain called next." Inside the box was a letter, sealed with wax, and a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Nora's hand shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her grandmother's handwriting shaky but legible. "To my granddaughter, if you're reading this, then I have failed you. Failed to keep you safe from the burden that destroyed my sister and haunted my every day since. I tried to break the cycle by leaving, by never speaking of what happened here. I thought silence could protect you. I was wrong. The mountain remembers. The blood calls. And now you stand where Eleanor stood, facing the choice I was too pregnant and too frightened to face myself. You must understand, Eleanor didn't die because she was weak. She died because she loved. Loved me, loved the child I carried, your mother, loved this mountain and everything on it enough to give everything to protect it. I have lived with her sacrifice for 40 years. Some days the guilt is light enough to bear. Other days it crushes me. If you choose to run, I will not blame you. I ran, after all. Lived my life, raised my daughter, tried to forget. But if you choose to stand, know that you carry Eleanor's strength in your blood. You carry her courage, her determination, her capacity for love. The pendant was hers. She wore it the night of the ritual. It's not magical, not powerful, just a reminder that you're not alone. You stand on the shoulders of women who faced impossible choices and made them anyway. Whatever you decide, I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to guide you. I'm sorry I couldn't be brave enough to return and prepare you properly. But I believe in you. Eleanor would have believed in you too. Be strong, be brave. And if you survive this, know that you've accomplished what I could not. With all my love, Margaret. Nora read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother's fear, her guilt, her love, all of it plain on the page. A woman who'd spent 40 years running from a choice she'd never been strong enough to make. Kit was crying too, quietly, her hand resting on Ember's head. She gave this to your sister? Nora asked. 20 years ago, yeah. My sister was supposed to be the one. The mountain had called. The wolves had come. But she... Kit's voice broke. She ran. And your grandmother's letter stayed in that box, waiting. Nora fastened the pendant around her neck. It settled just above her heart, cool against her skin. A reminder, a connection to a woman she'd never met, but whose choice had brought her this moment. I'm not running, Nora said quietly. I know. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire the only sound. The wolves had arranged themselves around the room in a protective circle, silver thread at the door, the pups at the windows and corners. Guard positions, Nora realized. They were already preparing for battle. Tell me honestly, Nora said. What are my chances? Kit was quiet for a long moment. Of completing the ritual? Aye, if you do everything right. Of surviving it? That depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice and how much the entities push back. She looked at Nora directly. Thomas thinks you'll make it. Vernon isn't sure. I want to believe you will. And you? I think you're stronger than you know. I think you've been preparing for something like this your whole life, even if you didn't realize it. Kit smiled sadly. You were a social worker. You spent years standing between vulnerable people and the darkness that wanted to consume them. This isn't that different. It's just more literal. Nora thought about that. The cases she'd worked, the lives she'd tried to save. The boy under the bridge who'd haunted her dreams. Maybe Kit was right. Maybe her entire career had been training for this moment, learning to stand firm when everything screamed at her to run, learning to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. She'd failed before, lost people she'd tried to save, but she'd also succeeded more times than she'd failed. Reunited families, stopped abuse, given kids a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. This was just another case. A bigger case. A case where the stakes were literally life and death for thousands of people instead of just one. She could do this. She had to. That night, Nora barely slept. She kept the binding stone nearby, checking the forest every hour. The entities were a solid mass now, hundreds of them, so thick they blotted out the moonlight. They knew tomorrow was the convergence. They were waiting for their chance. Around 3 a.m, Silverthread came to where Nora sat by the window. The massive wolf placed her head in Nora's lap, amber eyes looking up with such trust and understanding that Nora felt her throat tighten. I won't let you down, Nora whispered, scratching behind the wolf's ears. Whatever it takes, we'll see this through together. Silverthread's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate. The pups joined them, Silver curling up at Nora's feet. Shadow pressing against her left side, Ember against her right. A pack surrounding their keeper, protecting her even now, when the danger was still hours away. Nora sat surrounded by wolves, watching darkness press against the windows, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose clear, undeniable purpose. Tomorrow night she would descend into that mine. She would mark the cardinal points with her blood. She would speak words of power older than civilization. And she would drive an obsidian blade through the heart of a seal that stood between the world and hungry darkness. She would do all of this because someone had to. Because she'd been chosen, yes, but also because she'd chosen. Opened her door to wolves in a storm. Stayed when she could have fled. Drained when she could have denied. Every choice had led here. And she wouldn't take any of them back. Dawn came eventually, grey and cold. The day of the full moon, the day everything changed. Kit arrived at noon with Thomas and Vernon. They brought the remaining supplies, checked and rechecked the ritual components, went over the timing one last time. The full moon would rise at 7:23 p.m. They needed to reach the mine by 10:30 to prepare. The ritual would begin at 11:17 p.m. and culminate at 11:47 when the moon reached its apex. They had 9 hours. Nora spent them in quiet preparation. She bathed in water heated on the stove, scrubbing away the ordinary world. She dressed in layers, practical clothes for the cold, the wolf pelt cloak over everything. She braided her hair back tight, securing it so it wouldn't interfere. The obsidian blade went into a sheath at her belt, the pouch of herbs into her pocket, the binding stone on a cord around her neck, next to Margaret Eleanor's pendant. At 6 p.m., as the sun set and the moon began to rise, Thomas performed a final blessing. He marked Nora's forehead, her palms, her heart, spoke words that made the air shimmer with power. When he finished, he looked at her with eyes that had seen decades of mountain magic. "The mountain has chosen well," he said. Eleanor would be proud. At 7 p.m. they set out. Nora, Kit, Thomas, Vernon, and 4 guardian wolves heading into the darkness. The entities parted to let them pass, a corridor of shadow leading toward the mine. They were being allowed through. Invited almost, because the real fight wouldn't start until Nora began the ritual, and then there would be no mercy. The cavern was exactly as Nora remembered: vast, cold, and wrong. The seal pulsed in the center, its cracks glowing brighter now, red light spilling across the stone floor like blood. Kit, Vernon, and Thomas took up positions at the cavern's perimeter. They couldn't participate in the ritual itself, that was between Keeper and Guardians, but they could defend against what was coming. Each carried weapons blessed by Thomas: iron knives, salt-loaded shotguns, burning sage bundles that threw sharp-scented smoke into the stale air. "We'll hold the line," Kit said, gripping Nora's shoulder. "You focus on the ritual. No matter what you hear, what you see, don't stop. Don't look back." Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. The wolves had already taken their positions. Silver Thread at the north point, Shadow at the south, Ember at the west. Silver hesitated at the east, the smallest of them looking suddenly very young and very scared. Nora approached her, knelt down. "I know you're afraid," she said softly. "I'm afraid too. But we're in this together, all of us. And together we're strong enough." Silver's blue eyes, still blue, even now, met Nora's. Then the young wolf moved to her position and sat, tail wrapped around her paws. Waiting, 11:17 p.m., time to begin. Nora moved to the east point first, where Silver waited. She drew the obsidian blade across her left palm, felt the sharp pain, watched blood well up dark and thick. She pressed her bleeding hand to the stone platform and spoke the first words of power. The syllables felt strange in her mouth, harsh and ancient, but they resonated. The seal responded with a pulse of light, and the carved symbols at the east point began to glow. Connection formed. She could feel it snap into place between her and Silver. The young wolf's eyes widened, then closed, accepting the bond. South point. Shadow waited, perfectly still. The same ritual, blood, words, power flowing. Shadow's bond formed with a surge that made Nora gasp. Strength flooded into her, the wolf's strength, his courage, his absolute certainty that this was necessary. West Point. Ember watched her approach with amber eyes that reflected the seal's red glow. Blood, words, power. Ember's bond carried warmth, steadying Nora's shaking hands. 3 points marked. 1 to go, North Point, Silver Thread. As Nora approached, the mother wolf stood. Moved to meet her halfway. This bond would be different. Nora understood that instinctively. This was the alpha connection, keeper to lead guardian. Everything else flowed through this relationship. She placed her bleeding hand on Silver Thread's head, spoke the final words of binding. The world exploded with light. Power surged through the connection, so intense Nora's knees buckled. She felt everything Silverthread felt, every sound, every scent, every vibration in the stone. Felt the wolf's memories flooding in, centuries of guardians, dozens of keepers, an endless vigilance against the darkness below, and Silverthread's true name entered Nora's mind with the force of revelation. When Nora opened her eyes, she was standing at the platform center without remembering how she got there. All four wolves were connected to her now, their heartbeats synchronizing. With hers, four became one. One became four. The seal awaited. Nora raised the obsidian blade, and the entities attacked. They erupted from the cracks in the seal, manifesting physically for the first time. Shadow things that writhed and twisted, reaching for her with appendages that shouldn't exist. The temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the stone. The very air seemed to scream. Silverthread howled, and the other wolves joined her. The sound was deafening, powerful, a wall of protection that pushed the entities back, but only for a moment. Kit's shotgun roared. Salt spray caught one of the entities, and it shrieked, a sound like tearing metal. Vernon was chanting something, his voice steady even as his hands shook. Thomas stood with arms raised, speaking continuous prayers that created a barrier of light around the perimeter. But the entities kept coming, more and more, pouring through the cracks like oil, like smoke, like living nightmares. The wolves fought. Shadow disappeared into darkness and reappeared behind an entity, jaws closing on something that screamed. Ember's fur caught fire, not burning but glowing holy flame that made the entities recoil. Silver darted between them, small and fast, her crescent marking blazing white, and Silverthread was magnificent. She moved like liquid death, protecting Nora with absolute focus, driving back anything that got close. But there were too many. For every entity the wolves drove back, two more emerged. Nora tried to focus on the ritual. She needed to speak the final incantation, needed to drive the blade into the seal's heart. But the chaos around her was overwhelming. Shadows lunged at her face. Cold that burned wrapped around her legs. Something that might have been laughter echoed through the cavern. She stumbled, caught herself. The blade was heavy in her hand, so heavy. Her palm was still bleeding from the cardinal markings, blood dripping onto the seal's cracked surface. The entities seemed to sense her hesitation. They pressed harder, reaching for her with impossible fingers, whispering things that made her mind recoil. An entity broke through the wolves' defense, rushed straight at Nora. Silverthread intercepted it, but the impact drove the wolf back, and Nora heard something crack. Bone or stone, she couldn't tell. No! The cry tore from Nora's throat. Silverthread struggled to rise, wounded but not defeated. Her eyes found Nora's. Trust, absolute trust. Do what must be done. Nora gripped the blade tighter. 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes until apex. She had to finish this, now. The final words rose in her throat, the words that would activate the blade, that would channel everything through her into the seal. The words that required absolute conviction and might require absolute sacrifice. Around her, the battle raged. Her friends fighting, the wolves bleeding. The entities pressing closer every second. Nora raised the blade high and began to speak. The words came from somewhere deeper than memory. They poured out of Nora in a torrent of ancient power, each syllable making the air vibrate, making the seal respond with pulses of brilliant light. The entities reacted like she'd struck them. They recoiled, screaming that metallic scream, but then surged forward with renewed fury. Desperate now. They knew what was coming. A massive entity, larger than the others, darker, the one she'd glimpsed through the crack days ago, manifested at the seal's edge. It spoke with a voice like grinding stone, words that bypassed her ears and stabbed directly into her mind. You are nothing. You will fail. You will break. Maybe, Nora gasped, still speaking the ritual words between breaths. But not today. The entity lunged. All four wolves struck as one. Silverthread from the front, Shadow from behind, Ember and Silver from the sides. They hit the entity with such force it shattered into fragments of screaming darkness, but the cost was immediate. Silverthread went down hard, blood dark against her grey fur. Shadow limped, one leg useless. Ember's glow flickered, dimming. Only Silver still stood strong, the smallest guardian blazing with white light, her crescent mark bright as the moon above. Nora felt their pain through the bond, felt Silverthread's determination even as her strength faded, felt Shadow's refusal to quit despite the agony, felt Ember's fire burning lower but not out. She felt their faith in her, their certainty that she would finish this. "I'm sorry," she whispered to them. "I'm so sorry." Then she raised the obsidian blade one final time and drove it down into the seal's heart. The moment the blade pierced stone, everything changed. Power erupted from the impact point, not just Nora's power, but the combined strength of all four guardians flowing through her. It burned through her veins like liquid fire, like molten gold, like every sunrise she'd ever seen condensed into a single moment. She screamed. Couldn't help it. The power was too much, too vast, threatening to tear her apart from the inside. But Silverthread's mental voice cut through the pain. Share the burden. Trust the pack. Nora stopped trying to control it. Stop trying to bear it alone. Instead, she opened herself completely to the bond. Let the power flow through all of them equally. 5 hearts beating as one. 5 wills focused on a single purpose. The seal began to reform. Starting from where the blade pierced it, new stones spread outward, covering the cracks, sealing them shut. The red glow faded, replaced by blue-white light that grew brighter and brighter. The entities shrieked in rage and terror. They threw themselves at the seal in a final, desperate assault. Hundreds of them, thousands, emerging from the depths in a black tide. But they were too late. The seal reformed completely, new symbols appearing on its surface. Nora's symbol, a crescent moon matching the pendant and Silver's marking, intertwined with 4 wolf prints. The mark of a keeper and her pack. The light from the seal became blinding. Nora felt power surge one final time, pushing outward in a wave that swept through the entire cavern. The entities didn't just retreat, they were forced back. Down, down into the depths where they belonged. The seals slamming shut behind them like a door to hell, closing with finality. Silence fell. Total, absolute silence. Then Nora heard someone sobbing and realized it was her. She was on her knees beside the seal, the obsidian blade still in her hand, her name now inscribed on the stone below Margaret Eleanor's. The blade had taken blood, had taken strength, had taken almost everything she had to give, but not quite everything. She was still breathing, still conscious, still alive. Around her, the wolves were stirring. Silverthread rose slowly, her wounds already beginning to heal with supernatural speed. Shadow stood, testing his leg, bruised but not broken. Ember's glow returned, steady and warm, and Silver bounded over to Nora, licking her face with enthusiasm that made her laugh through her tears. "We did it," Nora said, her voice raw. "We actually did it." Kit was there suddenly, helping her to her feet, checking her for injuries. Vernon stood behind her, tears streaming down his weathered face. Thomas approached the seal slowly, reverently, his hand hovering over the new symbols. "It's stronger than before," he said, wonder in his voice. "The bond you formed, 5 instead of the traditional pairing, it created something more powerful than any previous seal." Nora looked at the wolves gathered around her. They weren't just guardians anymore. They were pack, family, bound to her and she to them in ways that went deeper than blood, deeper than duty. She could feel the seal now, even without touching it. Could sense its strength, its stability. Could feel the entities far below, still hungry, still waiting but trapped, contained. The mountain was safe. For another generation, maybe more. Around her neck, the pendant warmed against her skin. Margaret Eleanor's pendant carried through one more ritual, one more victory. "Your great-aunt would be proud," Vernon said quietly. "She gave everything to save this mountain. You gave everything too, but you were smart enough to share the weight." Nora looked at Silverthread, who stood beside her with quiet dignity despite her wounds. The mother wolf met her gaze, and understanding passed between them without words. This was only the beginning. The seal would hold, but it would need watching. The guardians would need a keeper. And Nora had found her purpose in a storm, had walked through fear into something greater. She was the keeper, now, truly, permanently, and she wouldn't have it any other way. "Let's go home," she said to the wolves. Silverthread's tail wagged once, and together, keeper and guardians, they walked out of the darkness and into the moonlight. 3 months after the ritual, Nora stood on her porch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The coffee in her hands steamed in the cold March air, and beside her, Silverthread sat in comfortable silence. The mountain had changed. Or maybe Nora had changed, and now she could see what had always been there. The wolves had stayed, as she'd known they would. They lived partially wild now, hunting in the high country, running with what remained of their pack, but they checked in daily. Silverthread usually spent nights at the cabin, the pups coming and going as they pleased. They were nearly full-grown now, no longer the terrified creatures she'd sheltered during the storm. Shadow had developed the ability to move through darkness like it was water, appearing and disappearing at will. Ember could summon flame that didn't burn, protective fire that warded off threats without consuming. And Silver, sweet Silver, had grown into her crescent marking. When the moon was full, she glowed like starlight made solid. They were magnificent, all of them. The cabin had been expanded slightly. Kit had helped with that, adding a room that served as both storage and study. Nora had moved Margaret Eleanor's journal there, along with her grandmother's letter and the growing collection of notes she was making herself, because she understood now that this knowledge needed to be preserved. Written down, passed forward, she'd started a new journal on New Year's Day, leather-bound. Blank pages waiting to be filled with everything she'd learned and everything she was still learning. The first entry read, "My name is Nora Winslow, and I am the keeper of the mountain seal. This is my story, and the story of the wolves who trusted me when I barely trusted myself." She wrote in it most evenings now, recording the daily patterns of the seal. She checked it weekly, walking down into the mine with Silverthread to ensure the barriers held strong. She documented the wolves' development, their behaviors, the way the guardian magic worked through them. She was creating a guidebook, a manual for whoever came next, whenever that might be. Thomas visited monthly, teaching her more about the old traditions, the language of power, the history of the mountain that went back centuries before white settlers arrived. He'd introduced her to the tribal council, and she'd been welcomed with a respect that still surprised her. "You stood when others ran," one of the elders had told her. "You honored the old bargain. That makes you family." Vernon still brought supplies every few weeks, though Nora had gotten better at providing for herself. She'd learned to hunt, not as well as the wolves, but well enough. Had mastered the art of preserving food, of reading weather signs, of living with the mountain's rhythms rather than against them. Kit had become more than a neighbor. They were friends now, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Kit helped with the practical things, repairs, supplies, keeping Nora connected to the world beyond the mountain when connection was necessary. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, they'd sit on the porch with whiskey and talk about Kit's sister, about the choice she'd made to run and the price she'd paid. "I don't blame her anymore," Kit had said recently. "I understand the fear, but I'm grateful you were braver." Nora wasn't sure brave was the right word. Desperate, maybe, or just stubborn enough to see something through once she'd committed. Her father had written back, finally. The letter she'd sent him after the ritual, explaining where she was, what she'd learned about their family, what she'd done, had gone unanswered for weeks. Then, in February, a response came. He'd known, it turned out. Not everything, but enough. His mother, Nora's grandmother, had told him stories when he was young. Stories he'd dismissed as the imaginings of an old woman, haunted by her sister's death. "I felt the pull too," he'd written. "When I was younger, I'd dream about the mountain, about wolves, about a responsibility I didn't understand. But I ignored it. Built a life elsewhere. I thought I'd escaped. He was coming to visit in April, wanted to see the cabin, meet Nora, understand what she'd become." Nora was nervous about that, but also hopeful. Maybe healing this old family wound was part of her purpose too. The mountain itself felt different now, lighter somehow. The shadows between the trees were just shadows again. The wildlife had returned in force. Deer, elk, even a moose she'd spotted near the creek. Birds sang in numbers that Vernon said he hadn't heard in decades. Life was returning to places that had been slowly dying as the seal weakened, and Nora could feel it all. Could sense the health of the mountain through her connection to the Guardians, through the bond she'd forged that night in the mine. She was part of this place now, woven into it, and it into her. Some nights she still had doubts, wondered if she'd made the right choice, if she could have gone back to her old life, if this isolation would eventually break her the way the social work had. But then Silverthread would press against her leg, or one of the pups would bring her a gift, an interesting rock, a perfect pine cone, once an entire rabbit that Nora had politely declined, and she'd remember why she'd stayed. This wasn't isolation. It was connection. To the land, to the wolves, to a purpose that mattered in ways that transcended individual cases and bureaucratic systems. She was protecting thousands of people who would never know her name, holding back darkness that would consume everything if given the chance. Standing watch so others could sleep safely. It was the most important work she'd ever done. And unlike her social work career, it didn't leave her feeling helpless and drained. It filled her up instead. Nora took a final sip of coffee and looked at the journal waiting on the table inside. She had entries to write, observations to record. The work of keeping never ended. There was always something to document, something to learn, something to pass forward. But first, she had a patrol to run with the wolves. They'd been restless this morning, eager to check the northern boundaries where they'd sensed something moving through last night, probably just an elk. But you never knew. Vigilance was part of the bargain. She stepped back inside to grab her coat, the wolf pelt, cloak for cold days like this, and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked different than she had a year ago, stronger, more settled. The wariness in her eyes had been replaced by quiet confidence. This was who she was meant to be, not running from responsibility, but running toward it. Not hiding from pain, but standing against it, guardian, protector, keeper. Silverthread howled from outside, not a warning, just a call. Time to go. Nora smiled, fastened the cloak around her shoulders, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The mountain waited. The wolves waited, and Nora Winslow, keeper of the ancient seal, was ready for whatever came next. Behind her, the cabin door closed softly. Inside, her new journal lay open to the most recent entry, ink still drying on the page. Some moments arrive unannounced and change everything. The choice isn't whether they come, but whether we're brave enough to open the door. I opened mine, and in doing so, became exactly who I was meant to be. Guardian, protector, keeper of the mountain's ancient promise that darkness, no matter how persistent, will not prevail as long as someone stands watch. I am that someone. And I'm not alone. I never was. The storm brought me the wolves. The wolves brought me purpose, and purpose brought me home.